I'm Solène from Solène Knits, and today I want to talk to you about grafting, which is also called kitchen stitch. So if you don't know what it is, it's a technique to produce a perfectly invisible seam, and it's used on live stitches. So instead of binding off and seaming your stitches together, you're gonna seam those live stitches with the technique that I'm gonna show you in a moment. So it's often used for sweaters knitted in the round, because we often have stitches to graft together at the underarm. It's used for the toes of socks. It's also used for a caul, for example, if you're knitting a caul and you want to have that perfectly knit finish without any visible seam. So the technique that we often see is grafting with a stockinette stitch, if you're working on stockinette stitch, but it's also absolutely possible to have that same invisible finish if you're working on any textured pattern like ribs or mouse stitch, seed stitch, or even cables. So I'm going to show you how we can graft so in stockinette stitch and in pattern. So I will show you how to graft in stockinette stitch. So first you need to have two pieces of knitting and you put your needles in parallel position, and with the inside, the wrong side facing in and the right side facing out. So you put your two needles in parallel position to get ready to graft with your live stitches. The yarn needs to come from the back, so the back needle, and so you thread it into a yarn needle and you are ready to graft. So first, the first step is to thread the yarn into the first stitch of the first needle. So you will need to thread that yarn so from the back to the front. So you go from the back to the front as if you were purling that stitch. So that you thread the yarn in. From back to front as if you were purling, and then you go to the second needle and you will thread the yarn from front to back as if you were knitting that stitch. Front to back as if you were doing a knit stitch. Now there are four steps that you need to repeat. So the first step is to slip the first stitch of the first needle knitwise, so as if you were doing a knit stitch, and then you slip that stitch and then you thread the yarn purlwise into the second stitch of the first needle. Then you go to the second needle, so the back needle, and you thread so you take slip the stitch off purlwise, slip the first stitch off purlwise, you slip it off, and then you thread the yarn knitwise as if you were doing a knit stitch into the second stitch of the second needle. And that's it. So those are the, the four steps that you need to repeat all the time. So what I like to do to remember it is to remember the four steps. So I will go slip one knitwise, then thread the yarn purlwise, and slip one purlwise, thread the yarn knitwise. So it's knit purl, purl knit. So slip one knitwise, thread the yarn purlwise into the second stitch of the first needle, and for the second needle it's purlwise and knitwise. So slip one purlwise and thread the yarn knitwise. So slip one knitwise, thread the yarn purlwise, slip one purlwise, thread the yarn knitwise. And you will keep doing this until you reach the end of your row. So when you're at the end of your row and you have only one stitch left on each needle, So you will need to slip the first stitch of the first needle, so knitwise, and slip the last stitch of the second needle purlwise. So you slip the stitches off, you fasten it all out. The first stitches of the row will be a little big, but you can make them better when you're weaving your ends at the end. And so as you can see, we have made a perfect knit row in the middle here, so it's perfectly invisible. So the only difference here is my color, but you should use the same color as the one you work with, and on the wrong side it's exactly the same. So that's how you can do stockinette stitch, grafting in stockinette stitch. Now, if you want to graft a textured pattern instead of a stockinette stitch pattern, the technique is exactly the same, but the different steps are different depending on what stitches come next. So you always need to be aware of what your next two stitches are. So in my case, I have made a little swatch, two little swatches of 2 stitches ribbing, 2 stitches white ribbing. And so to start off, I will start by threading the yarn so purlwise into the first stitch of the first needle and knitwise into the first stitch of the second needle. And then, so I have a little memo always with me of the different steps depending on what my next 2 stitches are. So here I have the next 2 stitches are 2 knit stitches, so it's exactly the same as when we're grafting in stockinette stitch. So it will be knit purl on the first needle and purl knit on the second needle. So I slip my stitches knitwise. On the first needle, I thread the yarn purlwise onto the second stitch, and then I slip the stitch purlwise on the second needle, and I thread the yarn knitwise on the second stitch of the second needle. Now here I got rid of my first stitch, so I only have 1 knit stitch and 1 purl stitch. So for 1 knit stitch and 1 purl stitch, I will do knit on the first needle and knit purl on the second needle. So I slip my stitch knitwise on the first needle and I thread the yarn knitwise onto the second stitch of the first needle. Then I will slip the stitch knitwise on the second needle and thread the yarn purlwise onto the second stitch of the second needle. And now I have 2 purl stitches. So for 2 purl stitches, it's purl knit knit purl, so it's the exact reverse as when we're doing 2 knit stitches. So I will slip the first stitch knitwise from the first needle and thread the yarn it was the opposite, so I will slip the stitch purlwise and thread the yarn knitwise for the first needle and slip the stitch knitwise and thread the yarn purlwise for the second needle. And finally here I have 1 purl stitch and 1 knit stitch. So 1 purl, 1 knit, I will do purl on the first needle and purl knit on the second needle. So I will slip the stitch purlwise, then thread the yarn purlwise into the second stitch. And for the second needle, I will slip the stitch purlwise and thread the yarn knitwise into the second stitch. And so on. And when you reach the end and you have only one stitch on each needle, you need to look at that stitch and see if it's a knit or a purl stitch. So in my case it's a purl stitch. So for a purl stitch I will slip the stitch purlwise on the first needle and knitwise on the second needle. If it were a knit stitch I would do the exact opposite. So knitwise on the first needle and purlwise on the second needle. So now I would weave my ends in, and you can see that the pattern is continued in the grafting portion here. So when I grafted purl stitches, I will have a purl ridge there in the grafting section, and here I will have some knit stitches. So the pattern is perfectly continued, and you have that neat finish, the same neat finish that you have when you're doing grafting in stockinette stitch. So I hope that this tutorial was helpful, and I wish you a very nice day.